There are places on Earth that were once alive with voices, footsteps, laughter, and the daily rhythms of human life. Cities where thousands lived and worked and loved and died. And then, slowly or suddenly, the voices stopped. The footsteps faded. The cities emptied. And the jungle, the desert, the earth itself reclaimed what humans had built. Tonight, we're going to walk through these silent places where stones remember what people have forgotten. In the dense rainforests of Cambodia, hidden beneath centuries of vegetation, there stood a city larger than any in medieval Europe. Angkor was the capital of the Khmer Empire, home to perhaps 1 million people at its height in the 12th century. Its temples were covered in gold. Its reservoirs stored millions of gallons of water. Its streets bustled with merchants, monks, artisans, and farmers. And then, over the course of a few centuries, it was abandoned. The centerpiece of Angkor is Angkor Wat, the largest religious monument ever built. Constructed in the early 12th century as a Hindu temple dedicated to Vishnu, it covers over 400 acres. Its 5 central towers rise like lotus buds toward the sky, representing Mount Meru, the home of the gods in Hindu mythology. The walls are covered with bas-reliefs, intricate carvings depicting scenes from Hindu epics, historical battles, and daily life in the Khmer Empire. But Angkor Wat was just one temple in a city of temples. Angkor Thom, the fortified city at Angkor's heart, contained the Bayon Temple with its 54 towers, each carved with 4 faces of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, totaling 216 serene stone faces gazing out in all directions. There was Ta Prohm, deliberately left unrestored by archaeologists, its stones embraced by massive tree roots that have grown through and around the structures, creating a haunting fusion of architecture and nature. The Khmer Empire was a hydraulic civilization. They built an elaborate system of canals, reservoirs, and dikes that captured monsoon rains and distributed water throughout the dry season. This system supported intensive rice agriculture that fed the large population and funded the construction of massive temple complexes. The main reservoir, the West Baray, is over 8 kilometers long and 2 kilometers wide, large enough to be seen from space. But this system had a fatal flaw. The intensive agriculture degraded the soil. The extensive network of canals and reservoirs required constant maintenance. As the empire weakened in the 14th and 15th centuries, pressured by invasions from neighboring kingdoms, possibly affected by drought, possibly undermined by internal problems, the water management system began to fail. When the water system failed, agriculture collapsed. The population couldn't be supported. People moved away, seeking better opportunities elsewhere. The capital shifted to Phnom Penh, closer to trade routes and the Mekong River. Angkor was abandoned, except for the Buddhist monks who maintained some of the temples, converting them from Hindu to Buddhist use. The jungle moved in quickly. Trees grew from rooftops. Roots penetrated walls, simultaneously destroying and holding together the ancient stones. Vines covered the bas-reliefs. Within a few generations, the great city was hidden, known only to local people and the monks who tended the temples. Angkor was never truly lost. Cambodians always knew it existed. But it was unknown to the wider world until French explorer Henri Mouhot visited in 1860 and published descriptions that captured European imagination. He didn't discover Angkor, but he brought it to international attention. Soon, archaeologists and conservators arrived, beginning the long process of studying and restoring the temples. Walking through Angkor today, you feel the weight of time. The stones are worn smooth by centuries of tropical rain. The roots of strangler figs embrace entire walls, their bark and the stone becoming almost indistinguishable. The faces on the Bayon gaze out with their enigmatic smiles, as serene now as when they were carved 8 centuries ago. The galleries of Angkor Wat stretch for hundreds of meters, their walls covered with intricate carvings depicting cosmic battles and historical events. But you also feel absence. This was a living city once. People walk these corridors daily, not as tourists, but as residents. Monks chanted prayers in these galleries. Kings held court in these halls. Thousands of people lived in wooden houses that have long since rotted away, leaving no trace except archaeological evidence of post holes and hearthstones. The wooden city is gone. Only the stone temples remain, and even they are slowly succumbing to time. The sandstone is soft, vulnerable to weathering. The roots that make the ruins so photogenic are also destroying them, cracking stones and destabilizing walls. Conservation is a constant battle against time, nature, and the sheer scale of the task. Recent discoveries using LiDAR technology have revealed that Angkor was even larger than previously thought. The laser scanning, which can penetrate jungle canopy to map the ground beneath, has shown an elaborate urban landscape extending for hundreds of square kilometers around the temple complexes. There were roads, neighborhoods, reservoirs, and agricultural features invisible to traditional survey methods. Angkor wasn't just a temple complex. It was a vast medieval metropolis, one of the largest pre-industrial cities ever built. The people who built Angkor created something that seemed permanent. The massive stone temples, the elaborate water systems, the sophisticated urban planning, all suggested a civilization that would endure forever. Yet it didn't. The city was abandoned, its population dispersed, its grandeur forgotten by all but a few. There's a lesson here about impermanence. Nothing lasts forever. Not cities, not empires, not civilizations. The jungle is patient. It waits, and eventually, it reclaims what was taken from it. Angkor stands now as a reminder of both human achievement and human transience. We can build wonders, but we cannot make them eternal. High in the Andes Mountains of Peru, at an altitude of nearly 2,500 meters, there's a city built of stone fitted together so precisely that a knife blade can't slip between the blocks. Machu Picchu sits on a mountain ridge, surrounded by peaks, overlooking a valley where the Urubamba River flows. It's one of the most iconic archaeological sites in the world, yet we don't know what it was called. Machu Picchu is a modern name, meaning Old Peak in Quechua. The Inca who built it left no written records. They had no writing system. The city's original name, its exact purpose, and the reason it was abandoned are all mysteries. The site was built around 1450 CE, during the reign of the Inca Emperor Pachacuti, who transformed the kingdom of Cusco into the Inca Empire. It was constructed in the classical Inca style, carefully cut granite blocks fitted without mortar, buildings aligned with astronomical events, terraces carved into the mountainside for agriculture. The precision is remarkable. The stones are cut with such accuracy that they fit together perfectly, and the joints have survived 5 centuries of earthquakes that would have destroyed mortar-based construction. Machu Picchu wasn't a large city. Perhaps 750 people lived there at most. It was likely a royal estate, a retreat for the emperor and his court, along with the servants, artisans, and farmers needed to maintain it. The location is spectacular, surrounded by sacred peaks overlooking the sacred valley, positioned where the sunrise on winter solstice aligns with certain stones and windows. Every aspect was planned with both practical and spiritual purposes in mind. But less than a century after it was built, Machu Picchu was abandoned. The Spanish conquistadors, who arrived in 1532 and conquered the Inca Empire, never found it. Unlike Cusco and other Inca cities that were occupied and altered by the Spanish, Machu Picchu was left untouched. The agricultural terraces were still planted for a while, maintained by local people, but eventually, even that stopped. The jungle moved in, covering the buildings, hiding the city from view. For centuries, Machu Picchu was known only to locals who farmed the terraces or occasionally sheltered in the buildings. Then, in 1911, American historian Hiram Bingham, guided by local people, visited the site. He publicized it internationally, bringing it to scholarly attention. Bingham initially believed he had found Vilcabamba, the last refuge of the Inca after their empire fell, but that proved incorrect. Vilcabamba was elsewhere. Machu Picchu was something different, its purpose and significance still debated by scholars. The setting is breathtaking. The ruins cling to the mountain ridge, seemingly defying gravity. Green peaks rise on all sides. Clouds often fill the valleys, making the city seem to float in the sky. It's easy to understand why people believe Machu Picchu was a sacred place, a point of connection between earth and sky, between the human world and the realm of the gods. The Inca called themselves children of the sun, and solar worship was central to their religion. At Machu Picchu, the Intihuatana stone, the hitching post of the sun, is positioned so that during the winter solstice, the sun stands almost directly above it, casting no shadow. This was one of the points where, symbolically, the sun was tied to the earth, preventing it from disappearing during the darkest time of year. Walking through Machu Picchu, you see evidence of sophisticated engineering. The terraces that cover the mountainside aren't just for agriculture. They also prevent erosion and landslides. The drainage system, still functional after 5 centuries, channels water through carefully planned routes, preventing damage to structures. The construction techniques, using stone hammers to shape granite blocks, demonstrate patience and skill beyond what seems possible with such simple tools. But the most haunting aspect is the absence. Machu Picchu is beautifully preserved, but it's empty. No smoke rises from the buildings. No one walks the paths except tourists. The fountains still flow with water, following channels carved centuries ago. But no one performs the rituals they once served. The city is intact but lifeless, a ghost of its former purpose. Why was it abandoned? We don't know for certain. The fall of the Inca Empire disrupted the social systems that maintained royal estates. Smallpox epidemics, spreading faster than the Spanish themselves, devastated populations throughout the Americas. The emperor who built Machu Picchu and his heirs who would have used it were killed in the conquest or died of disease. Without them, without the empire's administrative structure, maintaining a remote mountain retreat made no sense. Or perhaps it was something more deliberate. Perhaps Machu Picchu was abandoned as a strategic choice, hidden from the Spanish, preserved by being forgotten. The site shows no signs of violent destruction. It was left carefully, almost reverently, as if its residents expected to return but never did. Today, Machu Picchu receives thousands of visitors daily. The Peruvian government limits numbers to prevent damage, but it's still one of the most visited archaeological sites in South America. People come from around the world to see the city in the clouds, to walk the same paths the Inca walked, to stand at the edge of terraces looking out over sacred mountains, and wonder what rituals were performed here, what prayers were offered, what dreams filled the minds of those who built this impossible city on a mountain ridge. The Inca themselves are gone. The empire fell in barely 40 years, destroyed by Spanish conquest and European diseases. But the stones remain, fitted together so precisely that 5 centuries of earthquakes haven't toppled them. The terraces still hold back the mountain. The channels still carry water. Machu Picchu endures, silent testimony to a civilization that built for eternity but lasted only a century. On the east coast of Africa, on an island just off the coast of Tanzania, there are ruins of stone houses, mosques, and palaces built when Europe was in its Middle Ages. Kilwa Kisiwani was one of the wealthiest cities in medieval Africa, a major trading port connecting the East African coast with Arabia, Persia, India, and even China. Gold from Zimbabwe, ivory from the interior, slaves captured in warfare, all passed through Kilwa's port. In return came silk from China, porcelain from Persia, glass beads from India, and goods from across the Indian Ocean world. At its height in the 13th and 14th centuries, Kilwa was magnificent. The Great Mosque was one of the finest buildings in sub-Saharan Africa, with vaulted ceilings and carved decorations. The Sultan's Palace, Husuni Kubwa, sprawled across a cliff overlooking the ocean, with over 100 rooms, an octagonal bathing pool, and courtyards where merchants displayed their wares. The town was built of coral stone blocks, cut from the living reef and set with lime mortar. The architecture blended African, Arab, and Persian influences, creating a unique Swahili style. The wealth of Kilwa came from gold. In the interior, in what is now Zimbabwe, the Kingdom of Zimbabwe mined gold from rich deposits. This gold traveled to the coast, much of it passing through Kilwa before being shipped to Arabia and beyond. The Sultan of Kilwa controlled this trade, taxing it heavily, growing wealthy from what passed through his port. Foreign merchants established communities in the city. Kilwa's coins, copper and silver, have been found as far away as Australia, carried by merchants or perhaps pirates across the Indian Ocean. But Kilwa's prosperity depended on circumstances beyond its control. The gold trade required a stable interior, peaceful trade routes, and demand from distant markets. In the late 14th century, things began to unravel. The Kingdom of Zimbabwe declined, disrupting the gold supply. Trade routes shifted, and in 1505, the Portuguese arrived. The Portuguese were seeking to control the Indian Ocean spice trade. They sailed down the African coast, attacking and conquering Swahili trading cities, installing puppet rulers, extracting tribute. Kilwa was burned and occupied. Though the Portuguese eventually withdrew and Kilwa rebuilt, the city never recovered its former glory. The Portuguese had disrupted the trade networks that sustained Kilwa. The city declined, its population dwindling, its buildings falling into disrepair. By the 19th century, Kilwa was a small village, its great buildings ruins, its history largely forgotten. The walls of Husuni Kubwa still stood, but the roof was gone, exposing the rooms to rain and sun. The great mosque remained, but its congregation was small. The coral stone, once carefully carved and fitted, crumbled slowly in the tropical climate. Today, Kilwa Kisiwani is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Visitors can walk through the ruins, climbing crumbling stairs to the upper stories of Husuni Kubwa, standing in the prayer hall of the Great Mosque, imagining the bustling port city that once occupied this quiet island. But it requires imagination. The ruins are fragmentary, weathered, overgrown. The stone is soft, damaged by centuries of rain and neglect. Reconstruction has stabilized some buildings, but much remains as it was left when the city declined. Walls without roofs, doorways leading nowhere, staircases climbing to empty air. What's haunting about Kilwa is how completely it's been forgotten outside academic circles. This was a major city, a center of international trade, mentioned in historical records from China and Arabia. Ibn Battuta, the famous Moroccan traveler, visited in 1331 and praised it as one of the finest cities in the world. Yet most people have never heard of it. The ruins sit on a remote island, visited by few, known only to specialists and adventurous travelers. This obscurity is partly due to the lack of written records from Kilwa itself. The Swahili coast had writing, Arabic script adapted for the Swahili language, but few documents survived. Most of what we know comes from foreign sources, from travelers' accounts, and trading records. Kilwa's own voice, its own stories, are largely lost. But archaeology reveals what texts don't. Excavations have found Chinese porcelain from the Ming Dynasty, indicating trade with China. They've found glass beads from India, suggesting trade networks extending across the Indian Ocean. They've found coins from the Middle East, showing Kilwa's integration into Islamic economic systems. They've found evidence of industries, iron smelting, textile production, lime burning for construction. The picture that emerges is of a cosmopolitan city, connected to trade networks spanning thousands of kilometers, participating in an Indian Ocean world that was, in many ways, more interconnected than the Atlantic world would be for centuries to come. Kilwa wasn't isolated or provincial. It was sophisticated, wealthy, and internationally connected. Yet it fell, not to conquest alone, though Portuguese violence played a role. but to economic and political changes beyond any city's control. When trade routes shifted, when the gold supply diminished, when new powers rose elsewhere, Kilwa declined. The merchants left. The buildings emptied. The city that had thrived for centuries became ruins within a few generations. Standing in the ruins of Husuni Kubwa, looking out over the Indian Ocean, where dhows once arrived carrying goods from across the known world, you feel the fragility of prosperity. Cities thrive when conditions allow, when trade flows, when crops grow, when political systems function. But conditions change. Trade routes shift. Empires rise and fall, and cities that seemed permanent become memories. Kilwa Kisiwani is a reminder that Africa's history isn't just about Egypt and Carthage, the civilizations that connected to the Mediterranean and are thus better known in Western histories. The East African coast had its own sophisticated urban civilizations, its own international connections, its own golden age. That history is less known, less studied, less preserved, but it's no less real. The stones remember, even if the world has forgotten. In the Sahara Desert, in northern Mali, there's a city built of mud brick. Its buildings rising from the sand like the desert itself became architecture. Timbuktu has a reputation in Western culture as the most remote place imaginable, a byword for somewhere unreachable. But Timbuktu was never isolated. It was a meeting place, where the Sahara Desert met the Niger River, where North African Arab traders met West African merchants, where the Islamic world scholarship found a home in sub-Saharan Africa. Founded around 1100 CE, Timbuktu grew wealthy through the trans-Saharan trade. Gold from the forests to the south, salt from mines in the Sahara, slaves, ivory, and other goods passed through Timbuktu's markets. But the city became famous for something else: learning. By the 14th century, Timbuktu was one of the Islamic world's great centers of scholarship, home to the prestigious Angkor University and numerous Quranic schools. Scholars came from across West Africa and North Africa to study. The Angkor Mosque, built in the early 14th century, was the center of learning. But education wasn't confined to the mosque. Wealthy families sponsored scholars who taught students in their homes. Private libraries accumulated manuscripts on subjects ranging from theology and law to astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and history. These manuscripts were copied by hand, bound, and preserved, creating an intellectual tradition that lasted for centuries. At its height in the 16th century, Timbuktu may have had 25,000 students and over 100,000 manuscripts in its various libraries. Scholars wrote commentaries on Islamic texts, composed poetry, calculated astronomical events, recorded local history, and debated theology and law. Timbuktu was a provincial capital of the Songhai Empire, one of the largest empires in African history, and the empire's support helped fund scholarship. But in 1591, the Songhai Empire fell to Moroccan invasion. Timbuktu was conquered, its scholars scattered or killed, its prestige diminished. The city remained inhabited, but never regained its former glory as a center of learning. The trans-Saharan trade declined as European ships established coastal trade routes that bypassed the desert entirely. Timbuktu became provincial, remote, its golden age a memory. The manuscripts survived, hidden in private family libraries, preserved through centuries of political instability and foreign occupation. Some families kept manuscripts for generations, protecting them through wars, droughts, and foreign rule. The manuscripts were written on paper, some imported from Italy or Spain, some made locally, in Arabic or local languages written in Arabic script. They covered every subject imaginable: Islamic jurisprudence, Sufi mysticism, poetry, medicine, astrology, mathematics, history, and personal correspondence. In the 21st century, efforts began to catalog and preserve these manuscripts. Tens of thousands were collected in new libraries, digitized, conserved. Then, in 2012, Militant groups linked to Al-Qaeda occupied Timbuktu. They viewed the manuscripts as heretical, contradicting their narrow interpretation of Islam. As French and Malian forces prepared to retake the city, the militants began burning manuscripts. But Timbuktu's librarians had prepared. In a remarkable rescue operation, they smuggled hundreds of thousands of manuscripts out of the city, hiding them in homes across Mali, later moving them to Bamako, the capital. They saved about 95% of the manuscripts from destruction. What the militants burned were mostly old accounting ledgers and less valuable documents left behind as decoys. The manuscripts are now being conserved, digitized, and studied. They reveal a sophisticated intellectual culture that flourished in West Africa when Europeans still believed Africa had no history beyond Egypt. They show Islamic scholarship adapting to local African contexts, incorporating local knowledge and concerns. They demonstrate that Timbuktu was part of a broader Islamic world, exchanging ideas with scholars from Cairo, Baghdad, and beyond. Visiting Timbuktu today is to visit a shadow. The city is small, dusty, threatened by desertification as the Sahara expands. The mud brick buildings, though beautiful, require constant maintenance. Rain erodes them quickly. The Angkor Mosque still stands, as do other medieval mosques, but they're old and fragile. The city's population is a fraction of its medieval peak. Most inhabitants are poor, living in a region plagued by drought, political instability, and occasional violence from militant groups. But the manuscripts survive. They're housed in libraries in Timbuktu and Bamako, slowly being conserved, studied, digitized. Each manuscript is a window into the past, a voice from medieval Africa, speaking about concerns both universal and specific to time and place. They're evidence that Africa has always had history, has always had intellectual traditions, has always participated in global exchanges of ideas. Timbuktu's reputation in Western culture as somewhere impossibly remote is ironic. Timbuktu was never isolated. It was connected to the Islamic world through trade and scholarship, to West African empires through politics and culture, to the world through the goods that pass through its markets. Its obscurity in Western consciousness says more about Western ignorance of African history than about Timbuktu itself. The city's decline teaches a familiar lesson. Prosperity is contingent. Timbuktu thrived because it was positioned at the junction of trade routes and because powerful empires supported its scholarship. When trade routes shifted and empires fell, Timbuktu declined. No city, however wealthy or sophisticated, is immune to changing circumstances. But intellectual traditions are more resilient than political power. The manuscripts survived when the empire didn't. The ideas outlasted the institutions that produced them. In dark rooms across Mali, families preserved books they often couldn't read, passing them down generation after generation, protecting them because their ancestors valued them. And now those manuscripts are being read again, studied, revealing a past that was nearly forgotten. The desert is still there, golden sand stretching in all directions. The mud brick buildings still rise from that sand, their shapes softened by centuries of wind and rain. And in the libraries, the manuscripts wait, their pages filled with Arabic script, containing knowledge and stories and arguments from a time when Timbuktu was one of the world's great cities, when scholars came from distant lands to study, when learning flourished in the heart of West Africa. On a remote island in the Pacific Ocean, one of the most isolated inhabited places on Earth, there stand nearly 1,000 massive stone statues. They're called moai, carved from volcanic rock, representing ancestors, embodying the spiritual power of important chiefs. Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, as its inhabitants call it, is famous for these statues. But the moai are part of a larger story about a civilization that thrived in isolation, then collapsed, leaving behind one of archaeology's great mysteries. The Polynesian voyagers who discovered Rapa Nui around 1200 CE found an island covered in palm forests, home to numerous bird species, surrounded by fish-rich waters. It was the easternmost point of Polynesian expansion. thousands of miles from other inhabited islands. The settlers brought with them chickens, rats, and the sweet potato. They established a society based on clan competition, expressed through the construction of moai. The moai were carved at Rano Raraku, a volcanic crater that served as the statue quarry. Carvers would select a section of rock and slowly chip away at it using stone handpicks, defining the statue's shape while it was still attached to the crater wall. The work was painstaking. A large moai might take a year to carve. Once the front and sides were complete, workers would tunnel underneath, slowly separating the statue from the bedrock. Then came the challenge of moving these massive stones across the island. The largest moai that was successfully moved is about 10 meters tall and weighs 82 tons. For decades, archaeologists debated how this was accomplished. The island was deforested by the time Europeans arrived, so there were no trees to provide rollers. Some theorized elaborate wooden sled systems. Others suggested the moai were walked, rocked back and forth while upright, moved slowly across the island like moving a refrigerator. Experiments have shown that both methods could work. With enough people pulling ropes in the right rhythm, moai can be walked upright across terrain. Or they could be dragged on wooden sleds, though this would require more timber. Either way, moving the moai required significant labor organization and resources. Once erected on their platforms, called ahu, facing inland to watch over the villages they protected, the moai received their final touches. Coral eyes with obsidian pupils were fitted into the eye sockets, giving the statues a lifelike gaze. Some moai received cylindrical stone top knots made of red scoria, placed on their heads like hats. The effect was striking. These weren't crude idols, but sophisticated sculptures representing specific individuals, each unique. But at some point, moai construction stopped. The quarry was abandoned with hundreds of moai in various stages of completion, some nearly finished, just days from being separated from the bedrock. Many erected moai were deliberately toppled, pushed face down from their platforms. When Europeans arrived in 1722, they found the island nearly deforested, the population much smaller than the island could have supported, and many fallen moai. What happened? The traditional narrative, popularized by Jared Diamond, was environmental collapse. The islanders cut down all the trees, partly to move moai, partly for firewood and construction. Without trees, they couldn't build fishing canoes, couldn't escape the island, couldn't prevent soil erosion. Populations of birds that had provided food disappeared. Society collapsed into warfare and possibly cannibalism. The moai obsession had destroyed the civilization. But recent research complicates this story. The islanders were adapting to environmental change, not blindly destroying their environment. They shifted to rock gardens, which actually improved agricultural productivity. They developed chicken farming to replace marine protein. Population didn't peak until around 1600, well after the forest was mostly gone. The real catastrophe came from outside. When Europeans arrived, they brought diseases: smallpox, tuberculosis, dysentery. Populations with no prior exposure to these diseases were devastated. In the 1860s, Peruvian slave raiders captured and removed over 1,500 islanders, nearly a third of the population, including most chiefs and priests who held cultural knowledge. When international pressure forced Peru to return survivors, they brought smallpox back with them, triggering epidemics. By 1877, only 111 native Rapa Nui people survived. The toppling of moai may have occurred during these catastrophic times, as traditional beliefs failed to protect people from European diseases and violence. Or it may have begun earlier, during inter-clan warfare exacerbated by resource stress. Or it may have been a deliberate rejection of the old religious system that demanded so much labor for stone statues. We don't know for certain. What we do know is that the Rapa Nui people survived. Their culture continues today. Modern islanders have worked to restore moai, re-erecting statues on their platforms. The island is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Rapa Nui language and traditions are being revitalized after decades of suppression under Chilean rule. The Moai themselves remain enigmatic. Standing before one, you're struck by its presence. These aren't crude sculptures. They're sophisticated works of art, capturing something essential about the human face while also being distinctly stylized. The skill required to carve them from hard volcanic rock using only stone tools is remarkable, and the dedication required to create nearly 1,000 of them, generation after generation, speaks to deep spiritual conviction. The quarry at Ranoraraku is perhaps the most haunting part of the island. Hundreds of moai in various stages of completion, frozen in time. Some are nearly finished, just days away from being separated from the bedrock. Others are barely started, rough shapes emerging from stone. It's like walking through a sculptor's workshop abandoned mid-project, except the workshop is a volcanic crater, and the project lasted for centuries. One moai, still in the quarry, would have been over 21 meters tall and weighed about 270 tons if completed. It was never finished. We don't know why work stopped on this giant or on the hundreds of others left incomplete, but they remain silent witnesses to ambitions that exceeded completion. Easter Island is often held up as a cautionary tale about environmental degradation and societal collapse. But it's more complicated than that. The Rapa Nui adapted to their changing environment. They survived despite tremendous pressures. Yes, they deforested the island, but they continued living there. The real collapse came from external factors, disease and violence from European contact, that no amount of environmental stewardship could have prevented. The moai stand now as monuments to both achievement and loss. They're evidence of what isolated humans can accomplish through organization and determination, but they're also reminders of fragility. Civilizations can be undone by forces beyond their control, by invaders bringing disease, by raiders stealing population, by powerful outsiders imposing their will. The island is still isolated, still remote, its nearest neighbor over 2,000 kilometers away. The moai still gaze inland, watching over an island that has changed beyond recognition since they were carved. Tourists come by the thousands now, filling planes and hotels, taking photos, marveling at the stone giants. But in quiet moments, when tour groups have left and the wind blows across the grass-covered slopes, you can almost imagine the island as it was. Forest-covered, bird-filled, alive with the sounds of chanting and chisels on stone, moai being moved across the landscape, a civilization flourishing in magnificent isolation. In the dense jungles of Colombia, there were legends of a city made of gold. El Dorado, the Golden One, was said to be a king who covered himself in gold dust during coronation ceremonies, then washed it off in a sacred lake, throwing golden offerings into the water. Spanish conquistadors heard these stories and became obsessed. They launched expedition after expedition into the interior, searching for this city of gold. They never found it because El Dorado wasn't a place, it was a ceremony, a tradition of the Muisca people who lived in the highlands of what is now Colombia. But the legend persisted, and in some ways, the search for El Dorado represented the broader Spanish conquest of the Americas, the belief that somewhere in the jungle there were cities filled with gold, waiting to be discovered and looted, and sometimes they found such cities. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, was magnificent beyond Spanish imaginations, with temples covered in gold and a population larger than any European city. Cusco, the Inca capital, contained temples whose walls were literally covered in gold sheets. The gold was real. The cities were real. What wasn't real were the easy conquests the Spanish imagined. They arrived with superior weapons and horses, but they conquered primarily through disease, political manipulation, and alliance with subject peoples who resented Aztec or Inca rule. And even then, resistance continued for decades. The conquest wasn't quick or clean. It was brutal, devastating, and it destroyed civilizations that had taken centuries to build. In the Amazon, the Spanish heard stories of another wealthy civilization, cities deep in the jungle, kingdoms that controlled vast territories. Francisco de Orellana, descending the Amazon in 1541, reported seeing large settlements, cultivated fields, and warfare between organized groups. Later explorers searched, but found only small, scattered tribes living in relative simplicity. The cities Orellana described seemed to have vanished. For centuries, his reports were dismissed as exaggeration or invention. The Amazon rainforest was considered a counterfeit paradise, lush but poor in resources, unable to support large populations. The indigenous peoples living there were thought to be unchanged since ancient times, living in small groups as humans always had in the rainforest. But recent archaeology has overturned this view. Using aerial surveys and ground studies, archaeologists have found evidence of large, complex societies throughout the Amazon before European contact. There were earthworks, massive geometrical patterns, roads, canals, raised fields for agriculture. There were terra preta soils, black earths enriched by ancient peoples, indicating intensive agriculture and dense settlement. There were pottery shards in concentrations, suggesting large populations. The Amazon before 1492 was far more densely populated and intensively managed than previously thought. Indigenous peoples had modified the forest, cultivating useful tree species, enriching soils, managing game populations, creating what some scholars call cultural forests, ecosystems shaped by human activity to be more productive. Populations may have reached into the millions across the Amazon basin. Then came European contact and catastrophe. Diseases spread faster than the Europeans themselves, carried along indigenous trade routes. Smallpox, measles, influenza, populations with no immunity were devastated. Some estimates suggest that 90% or more of indigenous Americans died from disease in the century following contact. Entire civilizations collapsed before Europeans ever saw them. The Amazon societies Orellana observed in 1541 may have been already in decline from initial disease outbreaks. By the time later explorers arrived, decades later, the populations had collapsed further. The cities were abandoned, the agricultural systems failing without the labor to maintain them, the forest reclaiming what had been cultivated land. What Europeans saw was post-apocalyptic, the remnants of civilizations destroyed by disease. This is why El Dorado was never found, not because it didn't exist, but because by the time serious searches began, any large indigenous societies had already collapsed from disease. The conquistadors were searching for living cities, but finding only ruins and remnants. The golden cities they imagined weren't myth. They had existed, but they were gone by the time the Spanish arrived to search for them. The legend of El Dorado morphed over time, moving from place to place as each search came up empty. First it was in Colombia, then Venezuela, then somewhere deeper in the jungle, always just beyond the next river, over the next mountain. Expeditions were launched, men died, fortunes were spent. The search became an obsession, a symbol of greed and futility. But beneath the legend lay a truth. The Americas before Columbus were far more densely populated and socially complex than later observers realized. The pristine wilderness that European colonists encountered was actually a post-apocalyptic landscape, a world where perhaps 90% of the population had died from disease. What seemed like endless forest had been, in many places, managed landscapes, shaped by indigenous peoples over millennia. What seemed like small, simple tribes were survivors of larger, more complex societies that had collapsed. Recent discoveries continue to reshape our understanding. In 2018, archaeologists announced the discovery of extensive earthworks in the Brazilian Amazon, revealed by deforestation. Geometric patterns, squares, circles, avenues, covering hundreds of square kilometers, clearly created by organized societies. These weren't cities in the European sense, but they indicated complex societies capable of mobilizing significant labor for monumental construction. Similar discoveries are being made across the Amazon. LiDAR technology, which can see through jungle canopy, is revealing archaeological features invisible to ground surveys. Raised agricultural fields, fish weirs, roads connecting settlements, defensive earthworks. Evidence of societies that were populous, organized, and sophisticated. The Amazon itself may be partly an artifact of human management. Many tree species that dominate Amazonian forests are useful to humans. Fruit trees, nut trees, trees with medicinal properties. Their distribution isn't random. Indigenous peoples cultivated and propagated useful species over thousands of years, shaping the forest's composition. When populations collapsed after European contact, these human-favored species persisted, creating forests that appear wild but actually bear the fingerprints of ancient management. So where is El Dorado? Everywhere and nowhere. It's in the terra preta soil scattered across the Amazon. It's in the geometric earthworks revealed by deforestation. It's in the raised agricultural fields now overgrown by forest. It's in the pottery shards and stone tools found throughout the basin. The Golden City of legend didn't exist, but the populous, complex, wealthy societies that inspired the legend did exist. They just didn't survive first contact with European diseases. The tragedy of the Amazon isn't just that civilizations fell. It's that they fell so completely and so quickly that they were forgotten. Within a century, societies that had existed for thousands of years were reduced to scattered survivors. The ecological knowledge accumulated over millennia was largely lost. The infrastructure collapsed. The managed landscapes reverted to forest, and later observers, seeing forest and assuming it had always been there, concluded that the Amazon could never have supported large populations. We're only now beginning to recover this lost history, piecing together evidence from archaeology, soil science, and historical documents. Each discovery reveals more complexity, more sophistication, more organization than previously suspected. The Amazon before Columbus was not an empty wilderness. It was home to millions of people, living in societies we're only beginning to understand. El Dorado was a myth, but the world that inspired it was real. And understanding that world, recovering that history, matters. It changes how we see the Americas, how we understand indigenous peoples, how we think about human impacts on environments. The Amazon isn't pristine wilderness. It's a cultural landscape, shaped by thousands of years of human activity, now recovering from a catastrophe that killed most of its human inhabitants and destroyed their societies. The Golden City vanished not because it never existed, but because disease and conquest destroyed it before it could be properly documented. What survived were legends, hints, fragments. And beneath the forest, invisible to casual observation, the archaeological evidence waiting to be rediscovered. On the island of Crete, in the Mediterranean Sea, there was a civilization so advanced that when its ruins were discovered, archaeologists initially refused to believe they were European. The architecture was too sophisticated, the art too refined, the engineering too advanced. Surely they thought this must be Egyptian or Phoenician influence, but it wasn't. The Minoans were indigenous to Crete, and at their height around 1600 BCE, they built palaces that wouldn't be matched in Europe for over 1,000 years. The largest and most famous is Knossos, seat of King Minos in later Greek mythology, though we don't know what the Minoans themselves called it. The palace sprawled across 6 acres, a labyrinth of rooms and corridors on multiple levels. It had running water and flush toilets, amenities that disappeared from Europe after Minoan civilization fell and wouldn't return until the modern era. It had light wells bringing sunshine deep into the interior. It had sophisticated drainage systems channeling rainwater away from structures. It had vibrant frescoes covering the walls, dolphins leaping through waves, young people vaulting over bulls, priestesses in elaborate dresses holding sacred serpents. Walking through Knossos today, even in its partially reconstructed state, you feel the sophistication. The rooms are well-proportioned, the corridors deliberately designed. Storage rooms held massive clay jars. Pithoi, taller than a person, used to store olive oil, wine, and grain. The throne room contains a stone throne, still in place after 3,500 years, the oldest throne in Europe. Administrative areas held clay tablets inscribed with Linear B script, an early form of Greek that recorded inventories, transactions, and religious offerings. But here's what's remarkable. The palace had no fortifications. No defensive walls surrounded Knossos. No evidence of military preparations. The Minoans didn't build monuments to military victories because they didn't seem to wage war. Their power came from trade, from their navy that controlled the Aegean Sea. They were the first true maritime civilization, their ships carrying goods from Egypt to Syria, from Cyprus to the Greek mainland. This peaceful prosperity couldn't last. Around 1450 BCE, the palaces burned. Most of them were destroyed and abandoned. Only Knossos continued to be occupied, but under new management, Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland, who had taken over and adapted Minoan culture. The tablets found at Knossos are in Linear B, a Greek language, not Linear A, the still undeciphered Minoan language. The Minoans hadn't been destroyed by natural disaster. They'd been conquered. But before that conquest, before the Mycenaeans arrived, the Minoans experienced another catastrophe, the eruption of Thera. About 70 miles north of Crete, the volcanic island of Thera exploded around 1600 BCE in one of the largest eruptions in human history. The explosion was heard thousands of miles away. Tsunamis devastated Crete's northern coast. Ash fell across the eastern Mediterranean. The island of Thera was buried under volcanic debris, preserving a Minoan settlement. Akrotiri, like Pompeii, would be preserved 1,500 years later. For years, scholars blamed the Thera eruption for the fall of Minoan civilization. The tsunami would have destroyed the navy. Ash would have poisoned crops. The economy would have collapsed. But the timeline doesn't quite work. The eruption occurred around 1600 BCE, but the palaces didn't burn until 1450 BCE, 150 years later. The Minoans recovered from the eruption. They rebuilt. They continued trading. Something else destroyed them. That something was probably the Mycenaeans, Greek-speaking peoples from the mainland who had learned from the Minoans, adopted their writing, absorbed their culture, and eventually conquered them. The transition wasn't necessarily violent everywhere. At Knossos, the takeover seems to have been relatively peaceful, perhaps through intermarriage, perhaps through economic control that gradually became political control. But the distinctly Minoan culture ended. The palaces either burned or were abandoned. The sophisticated urban civilization gave way to a more militaristic, less culturally refined Mycenaean culture. And then, around 1200 BCE, the Mycenaeans themselves collapsed. Their palaces burned. Their cities were abandoned. Literacy disappeared from Greece for 400 years, the Greek Dark Ages. When writing returned, it was the Greek alphabet, borrowed from the Phoenicians. Linear B was forgotten. The stories of Minoan and Mycenaean civilizations survived only in myth. Tales of King Minos and the Minotaur, of the labyrinth at Knossos, of Theseus and Ariadne. When Arthur Evans began excavating Knossos in 1900, he was uncovering not just buildings, but an entire lost civilization. The tablets he found couldn't be read. Linear B wasn't deciphered until 1952, when architect Michael Ventris cracked the code and revealed it was an early form of Greek. Linear A, the Minoan language, remains undeciphered to this day. We can read the inventories left by the Mycenaean occupiers of Knossos, but we can't read the original Minoan texts. Evans's excavations were controversial. He reconstructed parts of the palace using modern materials, concrete painted to look like wood, reconstructed frescoes based on fragments. Some scholars argue he created more of a fantasy than an accurate restoration, imposing his own ideas about what Minoan culture was like, rather than letting the evidence speak. But his reconstructions, however speculative, give visitors a sense of what the palace might have looked like in use: the bright colors, the sophisticated design, the deliberate planning. The Minoans remain mysterious. We don't know what they called themselves. We can't read their language. We don't fully understand their religion, though bull symbolism was clearly important. We know they traded extensively, but we don't know their political structure. We know they built palatial complexes, but we're not certain whether these were palaces for kings or administrative and religious centers managed by priests. What we do know is that they created something remarkable: a peaceful, prosperous, sophisticated civilization that thrived for centuries without apparent need for military conquest or defensive fortifications. They built palaces without walls, creating art that celebrated beauty and nature rather than war and power. And then they were conquered, their culture absorbed, their palaces burned or abandoned, their civilization ending not with catastrophe, but with assimilation. Knossos stands now as a monument to both achievement and loss. The reconstructed sections show what was, the ruins show what remains. Tourists walk the same corridors the Minoans walked, standing in rooms where ancient peoples conducted their business, worshipped their gods, stored their goods. But the voices are gone. The language is lost. The specific people, their names, their stories, their daily concerns, all silent, replaced by artifacts and architectural remains that hint at lives we can never fully know. The palace that time, forgot wasn't completely forgotten. The myths remembered something, but the reality was more complex and more interesting than the myths. No monster in a labyrinth, just a sophisticated palace so complex that it might have inspired those stories. No human sacrifice to the Minotaur, just a culture that used bull imagery in its religious art. The truth is stranger and more wonderful than the fiction. The Sahara Desert, the largest hot desert in the world, seems like the last place you'd find cities. It's a landscape of sand dunes, rock outcrops, and harsh sun. Rainfall is rare. Vegetation is sparse. The temperatures can reach over 50 degrees Celsius in summer. It seems inimical to human habitation, but the Sahara wasn't always a desert. Between about 10,000 and 5,000 years ago, the region was much wetter, what scientists call the African humid period. Lakes dotted the landscape. Rivers flowed year-round. Grasslands supported large animals: elephants, giraffes, hippos, crocodiles. And humans thrived there, hunting, herding, and eventually developing agriculture. Rock art across the Sahara shows this past. In the Tassili Najjar Mountains of Algeria, there are thousands of rock paintings showing cattle herders, hunters pursuing giraffes and elephants, people swimming in rivers that no longer exist. In Libya's Tadrat Akakis, rock art depicts similar scenes, a lush, populated landscape very different from the desert that exists now. As the climate shifted and the Sahara dried between 5,000 and 3,000 years ago, populations moved to regions that retained water, river valleys like the Nile, lakes like Lake Chad, and oases scattered across the desert. But they didn't abandon the Sahara entirely. Trade routes crossed the desert, connecting sub-Saharan Africa with the Mediterranean coast. And along these routes, cities developed. Some of these cities are still inhabited. Places like Ghadams in Libya, Timbuktu in Mali, Ouaddain in Mauritania. They're built of mud brick or stone, designed to cope with desert conditions. Thick walls for insulation, narrow streets to provide shade, courtyards for air circulation. They're oasis cities, relying on underground water, cultivating date palms, serving as stopping points for trans-Saharan caravans. But other cities are abandoned, half buried by sand, slowly being revealed by archaeology and erosion. In Mauritania, the ancient cities of Chinguetti, Ouaddain, Tichit, and Walata were major centers of Islamic learning and trans-Saharan trade in medieval times. They're still inhabited, but much diminished from their peak. Their old sections are slowly being abandoned to the desert, buildings collapsing, sand drifting through empty rooms. Excavations in the Sahara have revealed even older settlements. In Niger, the site of Gobero was a lakeside settlement between 10,000 and 5,000 years ago during the African humid period. Archaeologists found hundreds of burials, showing two distinct populations at Assiriste, different times. First hunter-gatherers, then herders with cattle. The site shows sophisticated stone tools, fishing equipment, and pottery. Then the lake dried up, and the site was abandoned, buried by sand until modern excavations revealed it. In Egypt's western desert, the Dakhla oasis has evidence of human habitation stretching back thousands of years. During the African humid period, it was more than an oasis. It was surrounded by lakes and grasslands. As the region dried, settlement concentrated around the remaining water sources. The oasis still supports life, but it's a shadow of what once existed there. The Sahara also hides evidence of ancient contact between distant regions. Phoenician coins have been found in Chad, suggesting trans-Saharan trade routes existed in classical antiquity. Roman artifacts have been found at oases deep in the desert, evidence that Roman influence reached far beyond the Mediterranean coast. The desert wasn't a barrier, it was a bridge connecting different parts of Africa and the Mediterranean world. But crossing the Sahara was dangerous. Caravans could lose their way, water sources could be dry, sandstorms could bury people alive. Yet the trade continued because the rewards were worth the risks. Gold from West Africa, salt from Saharan mines, slaves from various sources, ivory, and other goods crossed the desert, creating wealth for the cities that controlled the routes. The desert also preserves. The dry conditions mean that organic materials that would decay elsewhere can survive for thousands of years. Mummies from ancient burials are naturally preserved by the dry heat. Wooden artifacts, textiles, and even food can survive. The sand that buries sites also protects them from weathering and human disturbance. This means the Sahara potentially holds thousands of undiscovered archaeological sites. Every sand dune could be covering ruins. Every rock shelter might contain ancient art. The desert is vast, and systematic survey is difficult. Sites are discovered by accident. A traveler noticing artifacts on the surface, erosion exposing buried structures, satellite imagery revealing patterns invisible from the ground. Modern technology is helping. Satellite imagery can detect subtle changes in soil moisture, vegetation, or topography that indicate buried structures. Ground-penetrating radar can see beneath sand without excavation. LiDAR, though less useful in deserts than in forests, can still reveal landscape features. As these technologies improve and are applied systematically, more Saharan sites will be discovered. But the desert is also destroying sites. Wind erosion is constant. Sand movement buries and uncovers sites repeatedly. Climate change is making the Sahara even drier and hotter, potentially accelerating erosion. Sites that have survived for thousands of years under sand are now being exposed and weathered away before archaeologists can document them. The Sahara teaches us that landscapes change, sometimes dramatically. What is desert now was grassland. What seems uninhabitable was once home to thriving populations. The cities that developed in the desert adapted to harsh conditions, creating architecture and social systems suited to extreme environments. But when conditions became too harsh, when water sources failed or trade routes shifted, the cities were abandoned. The desert reclaimed what had briefly been taken from it. Standing in a ruined Saharan city, feeling the wind blow sand through empty doorways, you understand impermanence viscerally. The desert is patient, it waits, and eventually it reclaims everything. The cities that seemed permanent were temporary, brief human attempts to impose order on a landscape that doesn't care about human ambitions. The sand remembers nothing. It just moves, covering and uncovering, burying and revealing, indifferent to what lies beneath. We've journeyed through lost cities tonight, from Angkor's Temple Mountains to Machu Picchu's cloud-piercing peaks, from Kilwa's coral stone houses to Timbuktu's mud brick libraries, from Easter Island's stone sentinels to the Amazon's hidden earthworks, from Knossos' sophisticated palaces to the Sahara's desert cities. Each place tells a similar story. Humans building, thriving, creating civilizations that seem permanent. And then, for various reasons, those civilizations ending, the cities emptying, the stones falling silent. These aren't ancient history. They're warnings and lessons. Every civilization believes it will last forever. The people of Angkor didn't think their city would be swallowed by jungle. The Rapa Nui carving Moai didn't expect their civilization would collapse. The scholars of Timbuktu didn't anticipate their libraries would be burned, or their city would become synonymous with remoteness. But conditions change, climates shift, empires fall, trade routes move, diseases devastate, and what seemed permanent proves temporary. Yet human resilience is remarkable. The descendants of these civilizations still exist. They maintain connections to their past, even when that past is fragmentary and partially forgotten. They rebuild, adapt, continue. Angkor is now a symbol of Cambodian national identity, carefully preserved. Machu Picchu is protected and celebrated. Timbuktu's manuscripts were saved from destruction by people who valued them despite political chaos. Rapa Nui culture is being revitalized by people determined not to let it disappear. The stones remain, weathering slowly, marking places where people once lived intensely. They're evidence that we were here, that we built things, that we mattered, if only briefly in the vast span of geological time. They're monuments to both human ambition and human fragility. Walking through these ruins, you feel the presence of absence. Life once filled these spaces. Conversations, laughter, arguments, daily routines, ceremonies, births, deaths, all the drama of human existence. Now there's only silence, broken by wind or rain or the occasional tourist. The places endure, but the lives are gone, knowable only through artifacts and educated guesses. This is what haunts about lost cities. Not that they're lost. We've found them, we study them, we protect them, but that the people are lost. The individuals who walked these streets, who carved these stones, who painted these walls. They're gone so completely that we don't even know their names. They're anonymous, reduced to the Minoans, the Khmer, the Rapa Nui, collective identities that erase individual humanity. Yet they were individuals, just as human as we are, with the same hopes and fears and dreams. They looked up at the same stars we see, though they understood them differently. They felt the same sun, though it meant different things to their lives. They experienced joy and sorrow, success and failure, love and loss. They were fully human, fully alive, fully present in their moments. And now they're gone. Their cities remain as shadows, hints of what was. The stones can't tell us what jokes they laughed at, what songs they sang, what foods they preferred, what kept them awake at night. The artifacts are silent about the things that mattered most. The private thoughts, the personal relationships, the small moments that made up their daily lives. This is the tragedy of lost civilizations, not just that they ended, but that they're lost to us in ways that matter most. We can reconstruct their buildings, analyze their pottery, translate their writings when they exist, but we can't truly know them as people. The human connection is severed, the continuity broken. Yet knowing this, standing in these places, you feel something. a recognition that these were places where life happened, where people lived as intensely and fully as we do now. The specific details are lost, but the essential humanity remains evident. They built, created, struggled, triumphed, failed, continued, just as we do. The particulars differ, but the fundamentals are the same. As you drift toward sleep, imagine these cities in their prime. Angkor with its streets full of people, its temples alive with ceremony. Machu Picchu with smoke rising from buildings, the terraces carefully tended. Kilwa's harbor full of dhows from distant lands, merchants haggling in the markets. Timbuktu's scholars debating in the mosques, students copying manuscripts by lamplight. The Rapa Nui moving moai across the island, chanting as they work. The Minoans at Knossos, going about their business in a palace that seemed eternal. See these places alive, full of purpose and activity. Hear the voices that once filled them, the languages we may never understand, speaking about concerns that seemed important at the time. Feel the presence of countless lives, each one as complex and meaningful as yours, each one living fully in their moment. And then let those images fade as the cities themselves faded. Let the voices quiet as they did over centuries or decades or sometimes suddenly. Let the life drain away, slowly or quickly, leaving only stones and silence. This is the rhythm of civilizations. Rise and fall, building and decay, presence and absence. But remember that while the cities fell, the people didn't disappear entirely. They moved, adapted, changed, continued in different forms. Their descendants live today, carrying fragments of their ancestors' cultures, maintaining connections however tenuous to the past. The civilizations ended, but the people persisted. This is the real lesson of lost cities. Not that everything ends, though it does, but that everything changes. Civilizations transform, adapt, evolve. What seems like ending is often transformation. The great cities emptied, but the people who built them didn't vanish. They just became something else, somewhere else. Sleep now, knowing that you're part of this same pattern. Your civilization seems permanent too, but it's changing even as you sleep. In centuries or millennia, people might walk through our ruins, wondering about us the way we wonder about Angkor or Machu Picchu. They'll see our buildings, analyze our artifacts, translate our writings, but they won't fully know us as people. Our private thoughts, our personal moments, our essential humanity will be as mysterious to them as the Minoans or the Khmer are to us. But that's okay. We're here now, fully alive, experiencing our moment. The cities we build might fall, but right now they stand. The civilizations we participate in might transform beyond recognition, but right now they exist. We matter now in this moment, living as fully and humanly as people have always lived. The lost cities wait in silence, their stones patient, their emptiness filled with memories of voices long stilled. And somewhere, in the distant future, our cities too might fall silent, waiting for future archaeologists to puzzle over our ruins, to wonder about our lives, to try to understand what it meant to be human in our time. But tonight, rest. The stones will be there tomorrow, still silent, still patient, still holding their secrets. The lost cities will remain lost in the ways that matter most, yet found enough to remind us that we're part of a long human story. Building, living, changing, enduring. We're the latest chapter in a story that stretches back thousands of years and will continue for thousands more, through forms we can't imagine, in cities not yet built, by people not yet born. The civilizations fall, but humanity continues. The cities empty, but life persists. The voices quiet, but new voices rise. This has always been true, and it will remain true long after we're gone. Sleep well, knowing you're part of this eternal cycle of building and loss, presence and absence, voice and silence. The stones remember everything and nothing, and that's enough.